Good morning, I'm Milena Torciano, CEO of Mitigram. I'm joined here today by Victoire De Groote. Victoire is a renowned macroeconomist, head of country risk at HSBC. She joins me here today to discuss the impact of the current crisis on the global economy and on world trade. Good morning, Victoire, and welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Milena.
Good morning. Pleasure to have you here. So my first question is, COVID has certainly caused a sharp recession with levels of GDP losses and output reduction not seen since World War II, really. Is this, in your mind, a one-off shock that will be followed by a rapid recovery and normalization of markets, or will it lead, in your view, to a permanent output reduction and lost growth, ultimately?
I think this is really the very right way to ask the question, because it's a one shock. It's a shock that was not predictable, and it's a single shot, but it will have lasting effect by opposition to the previous crisis, where we came out of them quite easily. If you think about the financial crisis, at the end it was really a V shape and we had a strong recovery. But this one is different for different reasons. The first reason is that it's a global crisis. All regions are affected at the same time. The second thing is that it's coming on top of pre-crisis, or at least movements of slowing down of the economy, and I think that that's really important. In addition, we have geopolitical tensions that are adding to that, and we have structural changes in behaviors. So I'm going to try to go through this. On slide 4, I think it's quite interesting because you can see that manufacturing production was already slowing down before the crisis. It's an inverted curve, so when it's going up, it means slowing down. Of course, you have the crisis of March 2020, but you see that in 19, already manufacturing production was going down because of the end of the cycle of the car industry and the IT industry as well. End of cycle is maybe too strong, but really a slowing down in these two. Manufacturing was also, and trade were also affected quite strongly by geopolitical tensions. And the COVID has been, crisis has been really emphasizing this and worsening it very strongly. But the basis was already a slowing down. On slide 5, it's indicator I really like. It's produced by Citi, and it's showing that what they call the surprise index. So when it's above the line, it means that actual data have been better than expectation. When it's below the line, it means that actual data have been worse than expectations. So forget the COVID crisis, but you can see that already in 19, actual data were worse than expectations, meaning that there was a slowing down that people were not seeing. Now there is all an alphabet about the current recovery. Some people are talking about a V shape, some people are talking about a W if we have, as we have, a second wave. Some people are talking about a K. I'm talking about a square root, which is a bit different. It means that we went down very, very strongly. We had some kind of V-shaped recovery, but the second leg is not coming back to the same level as the pre-crisis level, and it's stagnating at a certain moment. So basically, GDP will not come back to where we were before the crisis, and this is for different reasons, and it's beginning to stagnate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do you see we have already seen the worst in the macroeconomic indicators, or there are still bigger hidden risks to the global economy that haven't played out yet?
I think the biggest risk is about employment. In fact, employment has been supported in all regions, in all countries, thanks to a very strong intervention of the authorities, and that was needed. But the worst is probably to come on that side now that these schemes are getting to an end. In addition, the crisis has put in question the model of production, and it's certainly pushing for more automation in a lot of countries. So this means that will affect employment further. With very bad expectations in terms of employment, we could have really low consumption. So on slide 7, you see that unemployment expectations are really negative, and this is leading to a drop in consumption. If someone fears for its revenues, that person will certainly not consume as in the past. It's interesting to see that even in China, where employment has not been as severely affected as in other countries, a large part of the population is still saying that they fear for their revenues. So they fear changes in production. They fear that they could lose part of their real revenue, and certainly this is affecting consumption.
Yeah.
The drop in retail sales on slide 8 is showing the same thing. You have a massive drop on retail sales, and this could, of course, affect trade in the future.
Yeah, and where does this leave global trade? I mean, we have seen an exponential growth over the last 10 years. Are we really at the beginning of the end of globalization, in your view?
Maybe we have to differentiate the short term and the medium term. So yes, back to my element that trade was already slowing down before the crisis. If you see on slide 10, you see that this trend of slowing trade was there, mainly, as I was saying earlier, because of car industry and because of IT, while the 5G and new technologies were not already really there. So I think that this crisis will have lasting impact on different ways. First, you're talking about the end of globalization. Yes, I think that there will be changes in supply chains for different reasons. First, for production more in just in case rather than just in time. Also, security concerns in a lot of countries about medical equipment and all what is related to the pandemic. Reduced dependence on some specific countries, especially on China. But also, you have changes in behaviors. And that means that probably consumers will prefer some neighbor trade rather than very long trade. So if I come back to what we saw in the past, in 2019, the world economy was supported by services, while manufacturing were already going down, and we're going to have that further in trade.
And what is the impact of the rising geopolitical tensions and some of the conflicts like US-China worsening of relations or Brexit, again, on the evolution of global trade?
Yes, I think that global trade can be really affected for the longer term. I think that first, focusing on the US-China conflict, we have to take into account that whatever administration is coming in the US, this conflict will remain. It's not a question of short term and of the current administration, is really a question of supremacy on the high-tech and big data sectors in the very long term. And China will not give up very easily, but the US will not either. So we're entering in a long-term process that will be very difficult, whatever administration. Probably a Biden administration would make it more consensual. We'll try to obtain support from European countries and other allies, different way than the current administration, but nevertheless, the conflict is there to stay and certainly will affect trade between the two regions, but will also oblige other regions to choose one of the two. I think we're going to have two major dominant countries in the world, and other countries for the new technologies will have to choose one of the two, and will have to choose their camp, and that will affect trade among the countries. Brexit is a very different issue. Then we will know also in the coming weeks, I suppose. Let's take the worst case scenario of a no deal Brexit. That would affect quite severely the world trade, the European trade, that's for certain, UK trade, obviously, but it could also raise or protectionism worldwide, and it shows that protectionism is working, and it could push other countries to have these kind of ideas, which is certainly negative for world trade. The final thing is the oil conflict, if I can. It's not a real conflict for the moment, but nevertheless, it's the fact that producers are trying to manage the global supply and certainly trying to reduce supply in the US and in Canada by bringing prices very low. So that could also affect world trade.
Absolutely. And I was just curious to understand your views on whether there will be winners or losers from this crisis, in particular from the restructuring trade flows, maybe away from some sectors, more towards others, more towards certain trade corridors than others. How do you see the geopolitical recomposition of global trade?
Yeah, so I think that one of the results is certainly that we have lower world globalization, but we may have higher intra-regional trade. So, for example, we see more trade within Asia, not necessarily around China, also among the other countries. Same thing within Europe, where we already had a very high trade, but we see that some countries benefit. If I take the geographies, we can see, for example, in Asia, that Vietnam, Malaysia, but even Taiwan are benefiting of a relocalization, not only of Chinese enterprises, but also of foreign enterprises trying to get out of China. In Europe, because we are bringing back part of the production in Europe, you could have countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, that have already the potential to attract really an additional production, but also North Africa, that is very close. So it's always this kind of idea of closer relationships, easier one. So it means a change really in the structure of trade. The sharp rebound that we saw recently in trade is maybe a bit misleading, because that's mainly due to exports from China of equipment related to the pandemic, so medical equipment, but also all equipment related to working from home, so furnitures and these kind of things. But in reality, if you look at the manufacturing, the basic sectors, those ones are really suffering. And I think that the change in behaviors will also affect very strongly some sectors. For example, garments are really down, textiles. And of course, all is related to tourism. That's more related to the crisis.
Yeah, and I can't prevent asking you what this all means for financial sector stability. What will be the impact longer term? I know I'm pushing for time on this podcast, but the financial services sector has not really been the epicenter of this crisis as it was in the 2008-2009 crisis. But like then, a solvency crisis only followed a liquidity crisis. So in your view, will we see the same here? Are we now again at a cliff edge of rising defaults, rising bankruptcy, tighter credit conditions, putting even more pressure on the system going forward?
So this is completely different from the 2008 crisis for one major reason, is that banks are part of the solution in this crisis. They are not the reason or the cause of the crisis. They're part of the solution, mainly because governments are really asking them to grant credit and to grant support to all sectors of the economy, from households, SMEs, corporates. Banks have been granting massive payment holidays, and that was part of the solution, which is really important. Nevertheless, the pressure on banks is massive, because they see their non-performing loans increasing very rapidly in spite of all the efforts they have been doing. And at the same time, interest rates are at zero. There are talks about having negative interest rates, and this means that banks will have to find other sources of revenues. So we saw banks less interested in trade financing over recent years, because this was not generating the right level of revenues. Maybe this could be a positive change for trade financing. That's probably a long discussion to have next time.
Thank you, Victoire. I mean, absolutely. We do believe that the current crisis will only accelerate the pace of change across all sectors. And that's really what we are starting to see in Mitigram more and more. I mean, all counterparties in global trade, whether exporters, whether banks, they need to get closer to each other. There is a greater need for process automation, greater need for more liquidity options in many cases, and fundamentally a need for a new digital relationship amongst those counterparties. Thank you, Victoire, very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. That was a great pleasure.